Post-World War I and prior to the Great Depression, American politics saw three Republican presidents in succession: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All of them received comfortable margins of victory over their contenders in their respective elections. This trend of Republican success in national elections would all begin to invert after October 24, 1929, so-called Black Thursday, and the extraordinary economic depression which would ensue. After the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and his subsequent inauguration the following year, American national politics would see Democrat dominance of the presidential office for the next 3.5 decades, with only one Republican, Dwight D. Eisenhower, winning a presidential election during the period. However, this trend too would begin to falter. After the presidency of Republican Richard Nixon, which ended in scandal and saw his vice president Gerald Ford serve out the remainder of his term, as well as the unexciting performance of Democrat Jimmy Carter during his tenure in office, a movement would begin to take shape on the national level in the late 1970s. A movement which would prove strong enough to support Ronald Reagan in his bid to win the 1980 presidential election, which would see his formidable victory over the incumbent Carter. This movement, which took shape on the national level in the mid to late 1970s, that successfully achieved a Republican victory in the 1980 presidential election in the shape of Ronald Reagan, is the topic which this video covers and will describe in further detail. By November 1932, Americans had suffered through 3 years of rampant economic depression. With no end in sight and the unexciting performance of Republican President Herbert Hoover, the focus of many Americans' attention will be won over by an experienced rising star in the Democrat Party, that of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a candidate running for the presidency who promised Americans not a revision to the economy, nor a loosening of restrictions on private businesses, but instead a New Deal, of which was designed with the intention to create jobs, provide stability, and overall save America from the plight of the economic depression. It was a noble goal and a likewise ambitious plan. Many in the American electorate liked what Roosevelt was proposing, and the results of the 1932 election would prove as much. Following November 8, 1932, Franklin Roosevelt would become the first Democrat in American politics to win the national election while earning a majority, not just plurality, of the presidential popular vote in over 8 decades. The last time that happened was in the 1852 election between Democrat Franklin Pierce and Whig Party candidate Winfield Scott. The 1932 election marked a truly monumental victory for a movement which had only reached national popularity and gained mainstream appeal within just the last few years. Ditching off the old guard and igniting a new ideological fervor within his party and eventually the country, that of pro-government intervention into and regulation of the economy, Roosevelt's ascendancy into the presidential office would serve as a benchmark and political blueprint for Democrats to reference in the years and elections to come. Nearing the end of World War II, and after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945, American politics would shift to a new era filled with new leaders who faced a new and ever-changing domestic environment which saw unprecedented economic prosperity in a global atmosphere that saw the ascent of a cross-continental empire that would dominate the focus of U.S. foreign policy for the next 4.5 decades, that of the USSR. After taking over the rest of what would have been Roosevelt's fourth term and winning his own election in 1948, most of Harry Truman's focus would be spent on dealing with the implications of World War II's end, as well as the commencing Cold War which would follow. Succeeding Truman for president was Republican Dwight Eisenhower, who, having served as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II, would use his popularity to propel himself into the office of president. He was the first Republican to hold the office in nearly 20 years. However, not all party constituents appreciated Eisenhower's position on the New Deal. Far from making peace with the New Deal like Eisenhower had suggested, many Republicans were seeking to pull back what they saw as a regulatory curtain which had been placed over the private sector. Nonetheless, Eisenhower was too popular and, in many cases, such as in Little Rock, too busy to care. After winning again in 1956, he would serve out the rest of his second term to completion, the first president to serve exactly 2 term lengths, that's 8 years, since Woodrow Wilson. Eisenhower would eventually be succeeded by a new Democrat who would have their own fair share of crises to deal with as president. However, These staunch anti-New Deal Republicans weren't going anywhere anytime soon. As opposed to making peace with the New Deal like Eisenhower had suggested, or forming their own breakaway party from the Republican platform, instead, they would lie in wait, gathering support from constituents and voters from within the party and forming a new wing of the Republican Party. A wing which would have its moment in the sun, if not now, then later. As John F. Kennedy came onto the scene with his winning of the 1960 presidential election, a close race with former Eisenhower Vice President Richard Nixon, his inauguration the following year would see him face down multiple issues of urgent concern. Among them, U.S.-African relations, domestic race relations, and a new communist dictator in Cuba. Firstly, Kennedy's focus was shifted towards the growing number of African nations gaining independence and whether they would ally themselves with the American or Soviet sphere of global political relations. His attempt to persuade African leaders to ally their country with the United States proved awkward when some Africans, during their visit to America, would experience instances much like what happened to an ambassador from the recently independent nation of Chad, Malik Sow, during his visit. This instance is written about by the historian Mary Dudziak in her book, Cold War Civil Rights. Quote, the ambassador drove from New York to Washington, D.C. along Route 40 through Maryland, stopping along the highway for gas, hoping to ease a headache and get a cup of coffee. The ambassador was refused service. This diner did not serve blacks. In pursuing the favorable opinions of African leaders and the wider world, Kennedy simultaneously found it necessary to engage with the concerns of Black Americans. He would find this opportunity in James Meredith, a Black American who in 1962 had been rejected from the University of Mississippi. Meredith claimed racial discrimination was involved, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled his exclusion from the university was unconstitutional. With Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett refusing to support the school's integration of Black Americans, it seemed that if Meredith was to attend classes, he would need outside help. This is when President Kennedy, quote, sent in federal marshals. Through the night of September 30th, a battle raged between troops and demonstrators. 2 people were killed and hundreds were wounded. The next morning, with troops in control of the campus, Meredith was registered. Despite the bloodshed, Kennedy proved to the country and the wider world that the federal government was committed to protecting the constitutional rights of Black Americans, a message he was eager to send. As 1962 approached its holiday season, the White House would be filled with anything but cheer. A crisis initiated by a multitude of factors, among them a naval blockade, Jupiter missiles in Turkey, and the infamous nuclear warheads to be stationed in Cuba, would coalesce to create an emergency the likes of which had never been seen and would cause the world to collectively hold its breath for 13 days in October. In spite of the danger which threatened an end to the human condition, through negotiation and much-needed communication between the two world powers, nuclear war was averted, and the world could exhale, at least for a moment. While 1962 may have been filled with an unprecedented world crisis, 1963, at least for America, wouldn't offer much of a break. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, an event occurred which hadn't happened in over half a century. A sitting United States president was assassinated. Among the political turbulence which would follow, the inauguration of then Vice President Lyndon Johnson would occur on board Air Force One. What followed was a presidential administration attempting to pick up the pieces of a domestic and foreign policy which the former had left behind. All this at a time when the next presidential election was less than a year away. Such uncertainty within the Democrat Party screamed a potential opportunity for those in the new, aforementioned wing of the Republican Party. In the lead up to the 1964 presidential election, Lyndon Johnson would announce his desire to run and face sizable opposition only from George Wallace, whom he would eventually defeat in the Democrat primaries. As for the Republicans, a senator from Arizona decided that now was the time for his voice to be heard on a national level. As the Republican primaries would conclude for the year, it became apparent that the native Arizonan, Barry Goldwater, would be the party's nominee for the election year. A showdown of sorts. Democrat Lyndon Johnson and Republican Barry Goldwater would face each other in their 1964 bid to win the presidential election. However, this was no ordinary election. The two men couldn't be farther from each other, ideologically speaking. With Johnson giving a speech in May promising Americans with the coming of a, quote, great society if his administration were able to enact New Deal-esque policies, and Goldwater presenting his track record as an anti-New Deal and pro-private enterprise politician, not just the two men, but two ideologies were in competition for the American electorate. When the results came in, it turned out that it wasn't quite yet time for members of a certain political persuasion's time in the sun. In a result which seemed to rebuke the ideology of Goldwater, Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide. It appeared that a nation which was still grappling with the death of its previous commander-in-chief wasn't ready to change direction and go in a course opposite to his. After the devastating and rather humiliating defeat, Goldwater would return to Arizona and go back to biding his time for an iron which seemed like it may never get hot again. Meanwhile, as for Johnson, much like Truman in '48, he was no longer the former vice president who inherited an office via the death of his superior. Instead, accompanied by a majority of the electorate's consent, he and his administration would carry on what he saw as the torch of the New Deal. However, during Johnson's new term as president, not all things would go as planned. 2 years after Johnson's landslide in the presidential election, a look back on the progress of the administration would convey two main developments. Firstly, his successes in creating those Great Society programs which he had promised to voters. Coupled with an exceedingly liberal Congress, Johnson was able to pass Medicare, Medicaid, and created the Head Start program, all done with the intention to provide aid and welfare to an increasing number of Americans, especially those disadvantaged through chance or circumstance. While Johnson could stand strong in his record of following through with his Great Society agenda, the second main development of his administration was less positively received by the general public. That is, his escalation of the Vietnam War. The conflict in Southeast Asia had been raging for quite some time before Johnson, with American involvement going back a whole decade. Yet his administration certainly didn't take a hands-off approach to the dispute between North and South Vietnam, nor quite frankly did they have an apathetic stance on Laos and Cambodia. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which saw American naval destroyers hit by torpedoes from supposedly unprovoked attacks by North Vietnamese boats, Johnson and his cabinet felt an empowered position in engaging more directly in the Vietnamese conflict. Interestingly enough, this move was in alignment with the desires of Johnson's former rival, Goldwater, on the issue of Vietnam, but more on Goldwater later. This escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam gave rise to an increasingly somber death toll which showed no signs of slowing down. Eventually, this rising of tensions in Vietnam would all come to a head. The Tet Offensive, the name given to what was one of the largest military operations of the conflict. Conducted in early 1968, it was a numerical failure for the Communist Viet Cong who organized the operation. However, despite ostensibly being an American victory, it led many Americans to question the efficacy of continuing the fighting in Vietnam and whether the costs were really worth all the bloodshed. Already unpopular due to his actions regarding Vietnam, when American media exposed the My Lai massacre, it more than finalized Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. A type of decision not made by another U.S. president since Calvin Coolidge, or technically Harry Truman, whom the 22nd Amendment didn't apply to because of this sentence within the amendment, which essentially grandfathered him into the possibility of running again in 1952 and would have meant serving over 10 years as president. But back to Johnson. Whether for good or bad, his resolve to not run for re-election would lead to a comfortable victory for Republican Richard Nixon, who promised, quote, peace with honor regarding Vietnam in the 1968 presidential election, and whom, much like Kennedy and Johnson had done, would face his own set of challenges as commander-in-chief. As the 1960s turned into the 70s, and Nixon was poised to follow through on his promise to have peace with honor, much to the dismay of the Goldwater crowd, things took a decidedly unexpected turn. Barely into his first year in office, an article published by the New York Times would expose Nixon's secret bombing campaign of Cambodia, Operation Menu, which not only circumvented the powers of Congress, but seemed to be in opposition to his stated goal of peace in Vietnam. Luckily for Nixon, the exposure of the bombing campaign campaign didn't quite stir the national controversy which it may have under Johnson. However, his administration's attempted cover-up of the break-in of the DNC headquarters in Washington, D.C. would lead to a different kind of controversy, a presidential-level scandal. Beginning in June 1972 and continuing for the remainder of his tenure, Nixon's entire administration would become bogged down by the weight of and national attention gained by what would become known as the Watergate scandal. Seeing the writing on the wall and facing almost certain impeachment along with removal from office, Richard Nixon became the first president in U.S. history to voluntarily, albeit with much external pressure, resign from the position of commander-in-chief. After leaving quite the, for all the wrong reasons, memorable departure from his position as president, Nixon's vice president at the time, a former House representative from Michigan, Gerald Ford, would grant Nixon an official presidential pardon and serve out the rest of his term. Attempting to perform an act successfully orchestrated in years past by Truman and Johnson, albeit this time having taken the place not of a dead president but a disgraced one, Ford vied for the 1976 presidential election, an opportunity to serve as president on his own terms. Unfortunately for him, he narrowly lost both the Electoral College and the popular vote by slim margins. His successful opponent, Governor of Georgia and former peanut farmer, Democrat Jimmy Carter, will go on to serve as the nation's 39th commander-in-chief, and this time hopefully make it out with no national scandals or controversies. While the Carter administration was not without its noteworthy moments and important trends, such as his inheritance of a quote stagflation economy, attempts to enact energy conservation policies, dealing with the national energy crisis and the recession which followed, as well as his management of the Iranian hostage crisis, as history would show, the lack of excitement which Carter brought to the Oval Office might just have been his downfall. After watching the economy worsen and worrying that America was losing its place in the world, many politicians and voters alike were losing faith in Carter. This effect did not just extend to his rival party. Even Democrats, most notably Ted Kennedy, then senator from Massachusetts, came out criticizing Carter's handling of the country, specifically for Carter's apprehension in supporting a national health insurance system. All this is not to insinuate that there was no enthusiasm and optimism in national American politics during the late 70s. Completely across the continent from Washington, D.C., a Republican from California was getting ready to launch his campaign for the presidency. Why is he so important? The biggest advocate of him running for the presidency and #1 fan is, you guessed it, Barry Goldwater. Republican Ronald Reagan is gearing up for a bid to win the presidency in 1980 and resembling his own campaigning for Goldwater in 1964 when his well-known speech, quote, "A Time for Choosing," made national coverage, Goldwater couldn't talk more boldly of Reagan. And this time, Reagan was choosing to run on an anti-big bureaucratic government, pro-free market, and anti-communist platform. Going into the 1980 election, Carter not only had to fight off a challenger in Ted Kennedy, but was facing down a charismatic and successful conservative politician from the most populous state in the Union, all at a time when it appeared that his administration was incapable of solving the issues of the day. It was all coming together. It was happening. The iron was once again hot, and that aforementioned wing of the Republican Party, led largely by Goldwater, was ready to strike it with everything they had. Whether it would work, only the results would tell. As the votes were tallied up on election night on November 4th, 1980, and the morning after, it appeared that the time and the sun had come. While not everyone agreed with Reagan, his message clearly resonated with a large portion of the American electorate who looked at the last decade and a half of American leadership and wondered if things would have been different if they had changed course earlier. Well, better late than never, they thought, and so Republican Ronald Reagan would win the 1980 presidential election in a landslide victory against an incumbent Democrat, something which hadn't been achieved by a Republican candidate for president since the 1988 election between Benjamin Harrison and then incumbent Grover Cleveland, nearly 100 years prior, thus officially breaking the stranglehold which Democrats had generally held over the presidency since the 1930s, and marked the first president since the New Deal who was, despite his his personal admiration and respect for Franklin Roosevelt pointedly against the foundational tenets which the New Deal was built upon. The Reagan Revolution didn't come out of nowhere, nor did it gain its source of momentum in the 1970s. While coming to national prominence in the mid to late 70s against the backdrop of a lackluster economic, presidential, and foreign policy performance, the roots of the Reagan Revolution first took shape in the form of anti-New Deal thinking and politicking in the 1930s in America. Without attempting to cast the pejorative term contrarian on the entire movement, one could say that the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s was a counter-revolt against the Roosevelt Revolution of the 1930s. Hey, if this video got you thinking or gave you a new perspective on Ronald Reagan, consider subscribing. It helps me keep creating content that's actually worth your time. I appreciate you being here and I'm grateful you tuned in today. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.